the Agrarian Change webinar. We're still waiting for people just to enter for a few more minutes, so we'll start in a couple of minutes. Yes, let us start now. Welcome to this Agrarian Change webinar organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS University of London. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS, and I'll be chairing the session. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Sreya Sinha from University of Reading and Enrique Castagnon here from SOAS. It is now my pleasure to welcome today's speakers, Noaman and Yahya Aftab. The topic of their presentation is Peasant Movements and Agrarian Change in 21st Century Pakistan. In that, they will assess Pakistan's rural movements, and as part of that, they will analyze Taliban as a rural insurgency and compare it with classic peasant movements in Pakistan. Noaman is an assistant professor of political economy at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan, of course. His research and teaching are concerned with the political economy of underdevelopment, particularly the relationship between rural movements, institutions, and agrarian change. Noaman has published in the Journal of Agrarian Change and Rethinking Marxism, and he has also written for the magazine Tanqeed. Yahya Aftab is an independent researcher and activist from Lahore. He works on political economy, rural development, and public health in the global south. He has worked on various research projects with the University of Essex and RID Associates in Denmark. He is currently the development manager for an edtech firm, Hood Initiative, which is working to improve female literacy in rural areas. So all that's left for me to say is that the webinar is also live streamed on our YouTube channel, and you can post comments and questions in the live chat at any time, both in the YouTube channel and here on Zoom, as I can see already some people have done. You should also know that we're going to record the session. If you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio and video. And you can find the full program of our webinar series on our website, Agrarian Questions. With that, I'll now hand over to you two, Noaman and Yahya, for the next hour. You got up to 55 minutes to be precise for your presentation, and that will be followed by a question and answer session. And with no further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jens. Thank you also to Sreya and Enrique for helping organize this. Thank you for hosting us. Very happy to be here. Some people who I'm referencing in the talk are here, so no pressure. The discussion that we want to have today, it's exploratory, it's still under construction, so we'd love to hear your comments. The main question that we're trying to address is to understand the variation in the forms that peasant movements take, or rural movements, I should say, take in Pakistan, and how we can think about explaining them. So to reflect on that, we'll be talking about three movements that are really in the northern part, or northern half of Pakistan, so to speak. So let me show you this map of Pakistan. And what we're going to be talking about is peasant movements in Punjab, and mainly in southern central Punjab. In this part, which is called the blue part, which is the federal administered tribal areas, FATA, which is now part of the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But this is an old map representing some of the timeline that we're going to be talking about. So it's really not all of Pakistan. We're ignoring Sindh and Balochistan. So we should be clear that we're talking about the northern half of Pakistan. And the movements we're looking at span the ideological spectrum from left to right. So on the left, we have the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, which means the Punjab Tenants Association. In the center, we have the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad, which means Pakistan Farmers Union. And on the right, so to speak, we have the Taliban Pakistan, although I'm not sure that they would consider themselves to be right-wing or left-wing or really any wing. But be that as it may, that's what we think of them. And we want to be very clear that we're trying to distinguish the Taliban in Pakistan from the Afghan Taliban. I think it's important to distinguish between the two. That said, these three movements that we're talking about all contend with the state and with government, albeit in very different ways. And to make sense of that, we kind of turn to Jeffrey Page's typology back from his book, Agrarian Revolution. So this is some classic peasant study stuff. And in that, he has different categorizations of how cultivators and non-cultivators interact with each other, and as a consequence, lead to different kinds of movements. The first is the Agrarian Revolt. This is really about tenants taking over land and fighting landlords to do so. So it involves land invasions, land occupations, but generally it doesn't have a broader horizon. And the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, or the ANP, actually fits into this quite well, although with nuances. Then he talks about the reform commodity movement, which is about smallholders, in his view, who are fighting for greater control of the market compared to the commercial capitalists who they have to deal with. And the PKI fits into this. It is mainly a movement for remunerative prices, not dissimilar to the Indian new farmers movements, which Yahya will be talking about more. Then there's a reform labor movement, which is really about rural proletarians. And in his surveys, it's them working on plantations. This is really important in Pakistan, but we're not covering it. And it's really important in Punjab. It may make a cameo if we have time, but this is not what we're covering. And then finally, he talks about the Agrarian Revolution, where you're talking about both redistribution of property and seizure of state power. However, the Taliban is not really concerned with redistribution of property in a programmatic sense, although that is an important part of its program. We should not underestimate this. So instead of categorizing it as Agrarian Revolution, I categorize it rather as rural insurgency, because it's not looking for redistribution of property in that classical left-wing kind of way. And in terms of what Jeffrey Page is looking at, generally most of the movements he's looking at are left-wing, but the Taliban, or left-wing or national liberation movements, but of course the Taliban represents something quite distinct. So what we want to do here is, by locating Taliban within this typology, we want to be able to compare them with Anjuman Mazareen as well as Pakistan Kisan Ittehad. To do that, of course, I'm drawing on the work of Christopher Kramer and Richards, and in terms of they're looking at conflict being driven by agrarian change, and Harun Akram Lodi's article on the Afghan Taliban, where he views them as a form of peasant resistance. So what happens if we take that model and apply it to Pakistan and the Pakistani Taliban is really the question that we start off with today. To assess this variation, we want to look at how structural factors interact with agential factors. So in terms of structure, what we're really talking about is agrarian transition, agrarian change in terms of capitalist development. But we need to understand that this is happening under the framework of a transition from state-led development to neoliberal development. That starts about in the 1980s and especially takes off in the late 1980s. And the thing is, it's not so clear. The distinction between these two is not so clear, and I'll show you in a second what I mean. But capitalist development, structural adjustment, or state-led or neoliberal, nevertheless has to encounter local forms. And there's an immense variety of forms in Pakistan as far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan is the 5th largest country in the world. There's 220 million people. It's based on a declining empire that had stitched together multiple social formations that reflects multiple ethno-national groups. So we're talking about really multiple modes of production or relations of production. And even though agriculture now contributes about 19% to the GDP, it's still about 40% of the economically active population is engaged in Pakistan, so in Pakistani agriculture. So really we're talking about a diversity of forms here. So we need to understand how capitalist development occurs through a variation in forms and relations of production in Pakistan. But it's not just an internal, and what I mean by this variation, for example, and how these things aren't necessarily distinct, this figure is going to become important later on. This is public expenditure on agriculture in FATA, the FATA, compared to Punjab. And this is a relative measure, it's not an absolute measure. So by no means is there more spending in FATA than in Punjab ever. However, in relative terms, what we're talking about is, if you notice, the spike in FATA spending is actually taking place in the 1980s. That's when funding for agriculture goes up. This is where neoliberal policies are leading to a decline in agricultural investment in Punjab. So you can see the orange line in Punjab trending downward and the blue line trending upward. And that's, of course, also because the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens in 1979. And FATA is right next to it. So we can see that state-led development can hit a break when meeting certain things. So this, oops. Something has gone wrong with the, there we go. So I've got it. So the class here is co-constituted then by caste and tribe. This is something we need to understand, but we don't really go into this too much in this presentation. The other thing that's important is to understand imperialism and to revive imperialism as a category of analysis, understanding, of course, that we need to understand its geopolitical dimensions and its political economic dimensions. The question is how imperialism interacts with the way that capitalist development is happening through these local things. And then there's institutions of power at the local levels, which take a variety of form, again, depending on caste, class, tribe dynamics, and gender dynamics too, which we don't really focus on in this. These can take informal or formal forms. And then these things, these structural and institutional factors interact with, in fact, constrain agency, but there is dynamism as far as agency is concerned. Ideology is not necessarily a given, although to some extent it is. We can't expect smallholding farmers to magically want too much more than remunerative pricing. The question is under what conditions and what they think it's going to take to get there. Similarly, it makes sense that tenants want land and that once they get their land, they're happy with it. But the question is who's leading them? And in fact, it could be the right and it could be the left. Similarly, organizational capacity, it makes sense that class access to resources constrains that. However, activity, experience in organizations, training also makes up for organizational capacity where capital may be lacking, or it bolsters access to resources. And so this is the kind of framework through which we're operating. And now I'm going to stop the sharing so you can kind of look at our faces. And in this framework, then we want to take a look at the Taliban, the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad, and the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab. I want to note here that we're mostly relying on secondary sources, except when it comes to the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad. That is based on work that Yahya has initiated, primary research. And so he's going to talk about that and the work that he's been doing. We're co-authoring a paper actually for a certain journal that shall be unnamed, but it's taking a very long time, and I appreciate the patience of the editors. Anyway, let's talk about the Taliban. The dominant critical approach to the Taliban in Pakistan is that it's a kind of external movement that's been imposed on Pakhtuns, it's been imposed on Pakistan. These are foreign militants, they're interacting with criminal elements, that kind of stuff. But there is an alternative critical approach. Again, as I said, I'm drawing on Harun Akram Lodi's work on the Afghan Taliban to say that actually the Pakistani Taliban is very much rooted in the social contradictions that emerge from agrarian and rural change in the federally administered tribal areas. The argument I'm making here is that the Pakistani Taliban emerges from the encounter of two elements or two factors. The first factor is these multiple, but mostly semi-proletarian classes. And by that, I mean a relative surplus population in rural areas that has been, or who have been rather, excluded from material and political benefits of very rapid agrarian and rural economic change in the latter quarter of the 20th century. This factor interacts with the organizational and mobilizational capacity that was gained by local commanders of the Taliban. By local, I mean Pakistani commanders of the Taliban when they were fighting in Afghanistan. So let me expand on this, looking first at rural economic change. Fatah's regions are arguably characterized by a contradiction between a communal mode of production, so to speak, when it comes to agriculture. But on top of that, you have a trading dynamic. So, if we're looking at Samir Amin's categorizations, it's communal plus trading dynamic. But the agrarian sector is mostly stagnant, and that encompasses the majority, whereas the commercial sector, the trading sector, is dynamic and has enabled capital accumulation for the few. So there is dynamic class differentiation, and it is co-constituted by tribal communal rights over property and returns on property. So there is consequential political polarization that accompanies economic polarization. A caveat about what I'm saying is that the agencies, there are multiple agencies, there are many agencies that have very different dynamics within them. And I'm mostly talking about Waziristan, which is near the south, at a very high level of abstraction. I'm going to leave a lot of stuff out. The fundamental point is that class and tribe-based polarization strongly conditioned the emergence of the Taliban in Pakistan. So let me cover some dynamics of agrarian change. First, as late as 2003, 97% of Fatah residents claim their primary livelihood as coming from agriculture, but this region does not have a significant agricultural surplus. State-led attempts did bring the Green Revolution to Fatah in the 1970s and the 1980s. Alia Qaim has worked on this a lot, and she points out how this took the form of scholarships to agrarian universities, leveling of land through heavy machinery so that you could grow stuff on it more easily, distribution and subsidies for seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, and stuff like that. So there was an attempt to bring the Green Revolution to Fatah in the 70s and 80s. However, it didn't really work to accelerate, well, it did work to accelerate productivity, but not to the extent that we might have imagined. Alia Qaim argues that this might be because the prevailing communal relations of land limited land productivity. On one hand, you could not do collective agriculture because it was done on individual plots by individual families. On the other hand, communal relations limited individual accumulation of land. So no individual could accumulate a lot of land and thereby raise productivity. But we might imagine a scenario in which smallholding farmers can increase their productivity if they have equal and adequate access to capital and to new technologies. But the argument we're going to make is that that does not happen. Here, unequal access to new technologies was based, as elsewhere, on unequal access to capital and power. Or in other words, agrarian class differentiation here is not strictly agrarian because preferential access to capital in Fatah depends largely on non-agricultural sources of income, which are often determined politically. Even the agrarian capital is dependent on politics, which we'll get into in a second. What's important here in terms of institutionalization of power is the Maliki system, whereby the British took lineage heads and transformed them from first among equals into hereditary paid intermediaries. Pakistani statecraft then took on this form. The British also, and the Pakistanis, appointed an external political agent who has immense authority in managing the Maliks, including imposing collective punishment and stuff like that. Maliks and PAs, or political agents, have mediated the opportunities for non-agricultural accumulation that increased dramatically in the 70s and 80s and strengthened their own positions. These opportunities include, first and most foremost, what I like to call extra-legal trade, but what the law calls smuggling. I call it extra-legal. Since the two wars in Afghanistan, this extra-legal trade has also included weapons and drugs, which are very lucrative, and it is an immense, immense trade, which also entails transportation, and actually puts Pakistan in the International Division of Labor as a very important economic corridor that goes from the coast into Afghanistan, into Central Asian republics. The second factor here, or opportunity, is out-migration. So Pakhtuns have been migrating out of these areas for a very, very long time. Robert Nichols has a whole book about it. But in the 1970s, they started to go to the Gulf as well. But recommendations for visas go through Maliks and the political agent. Third opportunity is extractivism. That includes mining and forestry, which became more important in the 80s and 90s. But this is also conducted mostly extra-legally, but it's still mediated through tribal negotiations, and the political agent issues permits. Lastly, there's the government itself as a source of accumulation. It's maliks who are allocated government contracts, such as in construction, and they are also the ones who influence allocation of public sector jobs, such as in teaching. So how these new forms of accumulation impact agricultural investment is something we have to go into detail, but we can infer that agrarian, non-agrarian accumulation could be mutually reinforcing. I could give some examples, but I won't for sake of time. Or rather, I'll give you one example, which is how the influx of Afghan refugees created a pool of rural labor, which is even cheaper than hiring already cheap local labor or even family labor. As a consequence, young men are freed up from agriculture so that they can seek migration to the Gulf, or they can pursue higher education outside of FATA. And Hassan Turi has talked about this dynamic. So these processes can lead to accumulation or petty accumulation and petty bourgeoisification, which is, however, dependent ultimately on agrarian accumulation or agrarian exploitation of labor. However, much of the capital that is accumulated in FATA is actually invested outside of FATA, and that exacerbates unemployment and underemployment therein, especially for the poorer classes who are unable to leave for out-migration or for higher education. These processes of class formation then create a capitalist and petty bourgeoisie on one side and an excluded surplus population on the other. And that's had important political effects. Several scholars have pointed out that starting in the 70s and 80s, the newly affluent could acquire malik positions themselves, reinforcing their capacity to accumulate and their capacity to influence decision-making. For example, in jirgas, which are councils, adjudicative councils, which make decisions or resolve disputes. The well-connected, the newly wealthy then cohered into the category of masharan, which means elders. And many of those who were excluded also came to cohere as a category of kasharan, or the youth, which means the excluded in other words. Particularly in South Waziristan and North Waziristan, this dynamic was taking hold, but it takes shape in different agencies in different ways. Maryam Abu Zahab in her work asserted that the kasharan were comprised of farmers, sharecroppers, landless peasants, artisans, workers in the transport sector, unemployed youth, as well as those belonging to minor lineages or powerless tribes. In different ways, the kasharan wanted a return to a pure tribal system or an end to the political domination of the Maliki system. It's in this polarized context that we then get the first war in Afghanistan, which is triggered by the Soviet invasion in 1979, and of course, American provocation as well as Gulf and Pakistani intelligence agencies, and Pakistani state really. It doesn't make sense to isolate the intelligence agencies at this point, who then responded through this proxy war, so to speak, in Afghanistan, although it's important not to undermine the domestic contradictions within Afghanistan and the problems of Soviet invasion. This is a familiar story, so I'm going to leave it aside. What I will say is that within FATA, the mullah, or the religious leader, the mosque leader, was actually an outsider to the distribution of resources of power and privilege and depended on the masharan or the elders. But they did preside over madrasas, which were composed of the Taliban, which just means students, who were from the kasharan, from junior lineages, from impoverished families, and even orphans. The Afghan war meant that a lot of funding came to these madrasas and mullahs as the students became important recruiting grounds for the mujahideen. So what we have then is state-led development and inter-imperialist rivalry, if we consider the Soviets to be social imperialist, facilitating a rapid class polarization and the emergence of new classes and ideological transformations. It's then in this context that the United States then launches its imperialist war of terror, which is what we call it in Pakistan, and we should call it everywhere, which then led to the capital T Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, becoming a phenomenon in Pakistan. Here we need to understand the organizational and mobilizational capacity of the Taliban. They took advantage of the instability induced by the imperialists. And what I mean by that is that the war of terror destabilized local institutions of governance in FATA. NATO's invasion of Afghanistan drove Al-Qaeda, but a lot of Afghan Taliban into FATA, where they were broadly welcomed. Then NATO pressured the Pakistani military to invade Waziristan in 2004. And that heavy-handed military assault led to the displacement of tens of thousands and involved indiscriminate bombing and even killings of civilians. As a consequence, many local elders joined the insurgency against the incursions, but it was the Taliban and the foreign militants who were playing leading roles. And then that resulted in the state, Pakistani state, they could not defeat them, having to negotiate directly with the Taliban and giving them material concessions in 2004 and 2005. As a consequence, the military came to replace the political agent, and the Taliban came to replace the Maliks and the Masharan as the political authorities in South and North Waziristan, which of course empowers these insurgents. So we can't somehow surgically remove imperialism from the picture when it comes to understanding Taliban. It is a direct consequence of imperialism in Pakistan. That said, the Pakistani Taliban build their power on the basis not simply of domination and violence, but also in hegemony or popular support among some classes and tribal groups. And they were able to do this because the Taliban, many of the Taliban were locals from Pakistan, from Fatah, who had fought in the jihad against the Soviets, or what they call the jihad, and they fought then against the Americans as well. This allowed them to gain skills in fighting, but also in governance, to intervene in local disputes and sideline local leaders. They developed fundraising capacities. So they were trained. These are trained people. They're not just a bunch of ragtag clowns running around. They're actually trained people. They were trained in Afghanistan. And then in Pakistan, when they were displaced to Pakistan, or they were reactivated in Pakistan, they applied the lessons they had learned to organizing the Pakistani Taliban. We need to understand this. Their appeal was also based on their promise to these semi-proletarian surplus populations of empowerment. They paid them, they gave them money. And when you're a mujahid, when you're fighting in the cause of God, then that gives you status, which has been denied to you through this tribal status stuff going on. The Taliban also empowered these marginalized groups to intervene in governance and exercise power while appealing to broader sections of the population. For example, in Kohat, there was disputes over distribution of coal. So is a communal distribution should be what happens, but one criminal element using violence cornered that coal and the majority of that coal. So the Taliban intervened. They neutralized that criminal element and ensured and enabled a fair distribution of those resources. As a consequence, you have these semi-proletarian youth who are now in a position to rule or govern. They did exercise considerable coercion. They killed over 800 Maliks and Masharan who cooperated with the Pakistan army. And they also asserted a strict Islamic morality, which they thought would solve things, which did turn them off for many people. So although they had mechanisms of developing popular support, they also expended a lot of that popular support through their rigid implementation and their violence. There's no doubt about that. However, it is important to quote one member of the Waziri elite who indicates that those who had no worth have become worthy, and those who were noble are disrespected and disregarded. So there is a class dimension here. A quick note on the ideology of the Taliban. They refer to Shariat, which is Islamic law, as justice, which is what they wanted out of this increasing polarization. And they mobilized the idea of jihad in terms of self-defense against the American invasion and later against the Pakistan army invasion. By way of concluding this section, let me suggest that the Taliban's methods are actually comparable to those of the Maoist insurgencies in the region, including in Nepal and India, although of course, and I don't want to underestimate this, they're very different in their aims and objectives. But Maoist insurgencies have often been rooted in marginalized castes and tribes, who are peasants or semi-proletarians facing direct exploitation and oppression by rural elites and government agencies. They've intervened in local disputes to provide quick justice, they've set up alternative administrations, and they've undermined or even assassinated local leaders. And they've connected the local grievances to a broader ideology of replacing existing state power with a new state power of new democratic revolution or people's democratic revolution. But in this case, in the Taliban's case, it's the Islamic emirate undergirded by Sharia. So I think we need to understand then that the Taliban is emerging from these kinds of rural dynamics. And with that said, I will then pass it over to Yahya to talk about Punjab and the emergence of the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad.
Thank you, Dr. Noaman, for setting up the stage for me. I'd be talking about the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad, or in English, Pakistan Farmers Movement. And I'd be talking about first the genesis of the movement and how it came about. Then I'd be talking about the class alliances and the shifting class, not contradictions, but the shifting relations between class and how that sort of paved the way for a phenomenon like the PKI to come about. And then finally, I'd be talking about the organizational and mobilizational capacity of the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad as a farmers movement. So basically, the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad emerged in 2012 in the southern districts of Punjab, namely the districts of Lodhra and Bihari. And basically what happened is a farmer gave an ad in the local newspaper, and farmers simultaneously sort of like spontaneously gathered in a ground. And then from then on, this sort of like mobilization spread into other parts of southern Punjab, and then to the whole province. And this movement coalesced into what we now call the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad. And the cause of this mobilization was obviously the high electricity prices for tube wells, and it had the price had gradually increased from 3 rupees per unit to 27 rupees per unit, which was something that was unacceptable to farmers in this part of the world. And so they thought that it was a good moment to sort of like come into the streets and mobilize for this cause. And what really introduced it, Pakistan Kisan Ittehad in the national political stage was that they sort of had a successful 19-hour-long blockade of a really main artery, a railway and a highway for 19 hours on March 1st, 2013. And this is when they were sort of like introduced on the political stage. The political administration started taking notice of them, and so also other political elites started noticing their presence in the rural areas. And a short introduction of the narrative and the ideology per se of Pakistan Kisan Ittehad is that it's a typical reform commodity movement, as Jeffrey Page's categorization. Dr. Noaman has already laid down the categorization that Jeffrey Page has given us. And so in his words, it's a typical reform commodity movement, and it relates itself to the contradiction between high input costs and low output prices for farmers. It's really comparable to the big Bharatiya Kisan Union in India, Punjab, in Indian Punjab, or the Shatkari Sanghatna in elsewhere in India. And I will argue that the PKI comprises of an alliance between second-tier rural capitalist elites and petty commodity producers. Now I'll explain what second-tier rural capitalists are in a minute, but I think petty commodity producers don't need an introduction as such. They are small holders who produce for themselves and for the market. And the second line of argument here will be that the organizational mobilizational capacity of the PKI is premised on similar networks used for electoral politics, which are namely deras. Deras are communal spaces owned by the local landowner where most of the political activity takes place. The party organizations which were based in the rural areas, which pre-existed in the rural areas. And this also sort of connects it to Jeffrey Page's argument about reform commodity movement. And he says this about American farm bureaus, that they were sort of formed around some sort of pre-existing organizational structure. And we see that happen with PKI as well. So now let me begin by discussing the political economic changes and class formation that happened, that paved way for a phenomena like the PKI to come about. And then we will obviously move forward to organizational and mobilizational questions. So unlike FATA, Punjab constitutes Pakistan's agricultural heartland, and it is the most populous province. It has the most It has the most farms. It is the main breadbasket of the country. And agrarian structure here is determined by colonial interventions, and namely the settling of the canal colonies, the settling of the pastoralists. In the 1850s, 40% of the province was pastoralists. They were sheep herders, and they were settled down into villages, as we know villages to be, by the British. And basically, the establishment of tenure relations came about. Landlords and tenant relations and were sort of like created out of thin air for most of the province by the British. And continuing this process, this sort of like agrarian change resulted in some areas with very large landowners that operated mainly through tenants, and other areas with smaller landowners who might have cultivated the land themselves or also operated through tenants. After independence, what we know of the agrarian restructuring here in Pakistan is that the Green Revolution took root, and it was brought under Ayub's modernization efforts to basically modernize society and the economy of Pakistan. And it featured a tactically limited land reform and also the support of mechanized agriculture, which entails synthetic fertilizers, HYV seeds, tractors, tube wells, and this process continued in the 1960s and the 1970s. And what it gave the country or the province of Punjab in specific is that agrarian capitalist class who relied on, who had land holdings of up to 500 acres. The rural aristocracy, as some have called them, sort of emerged as an agrarian capitalist class. And then there's also simultaneously a smaller, more involved farmer class, which had a land holding of about 25 acres to 100 acres. The agrarian capitalist class relied on sharecropping, whereas the smaller individual farmer had some sort of sharecropping and tenancy sort of tenure on the farms. What the Green Revolution also gave the province was that the large-scale evictions took place, and the influx of migrant workers and wage laborers into the province meant that the agrarian capitalist class relied on them as well to till the land and to work on their farms. Moving quickly on, because we're on a time constraint, I'd be talking about the idea, the time period of interest, which is the neoliberal, the start of the neoliberal reforms, which can be marked around the 1980s, and which are in some way or form still present and still functioning in the province. So this was basically the neoliberal reforms, as we know, were basically supported by 3 or 4 actors: IMF, World Bank, USA, the Asian Development Bank. All of these actors were involved in bringing about this agrarian development in the province, and this phase was basically characterized by retrenchment of state support and the growing of or the burgeoning of the private sector as we know it. And government spending, as Dr. Noaman would point out later, declined drastically in this period, and trade liberalization efforts were put in to open up the agrarian market for Pakistan for corporations to come in and sort of capitalize on the resources present there. This strengthening of the role of corporations can be epitomized by, for example, the role of PepsiCo in Pakistani villages or Pakistani rural areas. For example, one of the areas that we conducted our primary research, a large chunk of the farmers, or a large chunk of the big farmers were in contract with PepsiCo. They provided potatoes for potato chips, and so that this is the case for most of the Punjab as well. Some kind of corporations are working with local farmers there as well. Export-oriented production began, where horticulture and mango production, specifically mango production and orange production has increased in the recent past, and there are commercial farmers who are export oriented and who are facing the world rather than facing the local market, and they obviously exist side by side with small petty commodity producers, as scholars before us have called this system a bifurcated agriculture system. This continued to take shape in the 1980s and and is still sort of in the developing stages. Also, the neoliberal the neoliberal age also epitomized the fertilizer production being left to only 4 corporations and huge slashes in subsidies. So the government actually reduced subsidies on distribution and increased subsidies on manufacturing. So they were in effect actually benefiting the manufacturers and bringing the cost of production, bringing the cost of fertilizer up for the farmers. So it was a real contradiction in plain sight. Moving on. Increase of imports, especially oilseeds and cotton, has been growing rapidly. So oilseed imports is something that has grown because of a high demand of oilseeds in dairy farming, and dairy farming is also something that is linked to the kind of farming that is being promoted by World Bank and IMF and others in this part of the world. And then also cotton imports, which are in a direct detriment to the local cotton growers of Pakistan and of Punjab in specific, has increased. Cotton production has also sort of caused a massive sort of influx, a massive sort of move from growing cotton to growing sugar, which also sort of entraps the farmers in the hands of sugar mill owners who are sort of the biggest sort of like capital owners of the country, who were the elite and who are currently in power in Pakistan as well, and sugar and and basically sugar mills are at the nexus of all sorts of exploitation when it comes to farmers and the farmers selling their produce to these sugar mills. Increasingly, also something that also been noticed in the neoliberal reform era was that there was a gradual increase in electricity prices, and this also dealt a huge blow to the farmers, because increasingly more and more farmers were substituting towards electric tube bells, because diesel prices kept fluctuating. And so because of climate change and all other effects, all other factors, the canals or the canals in Punjab were drying up, so people were moving towards tube wells. And once electricity prices started growing up, running tube wells and owning tube wells was becoming a problem for the farmers. And tube well also and increased electricity prices are also directly linked to structural adjustment and to the IMF's policy of dictating these terms to governments. So this era of neoliberal development was characterized by withdrawal of state support and the entering of corporate players in agriculture. The entering of corporate players in agriculture created the basis of the alliance between the second-tier capitalist farmers, as I've mentioned before, and smallholders. So the problem was that because of this neoliberal development and because of this commercialization of the terms of trade in agriculture, the second-tier capitalist farmers and the small landholders, their interests were sort of getting aligned. And as we would get to know further, that the second-tier capitalist farmers capitalized on this opportunity and sort of developed a hegemony, which was expressed in the form of PKI over the smallholders, and sort of the smallholder or small farmers were basically the wheels that drove their interests forward. Because I've been discussing this phenomenon of second-tier capitalist farmers, now let's discuss what they actually are and what kind of antagonisms they find themselves in. So these second-tier capitalist farmers are basically your people who have about 25 acres to 100 acres of land, and who also have diversified incomes. So these people will also have some sort of factories or some sort of small means of income. They could be processing plants or bottling plants or anything, or they could be money lenders in some cases in the PKI body as well. So the second tier capitalist farmers are also sort of the local chaudhries, the local strong men of the villages, and in some cases, and they find themselves in antagonism with the large landed aristocracy, which is who hold about 200 to 500 acres of land. They also have this tussle with the urban industrial capitalists, who are basically the guys producing who are the guys running the textile mills, sugar mills, the fertilizer plants, and such. And they also have expressed have a conflict with IMF, World Bank, and all these imperialist forces that we've talked about, because these forces make the terms of trade worse for these second-tier capitalist farmers. Then, as I mentioned before, all of these class actors are also sort of up against small farmers. So this creates ground or the basis for this alliance that was expressed in the form of PKI to form, where the second-tier capitalist farmers and the small farmers sort of like join together to sort of struggle against these factors that I've just named. So talking about the organization of the PKI is led by people who are trained in electoral politics as junior counterparts to aristocracy. So a member of National Assembly or a member of the Provincial Assembly would belong to, in Punjab, would belong to the landed aristocracy, whereas the second-tier capitalist would be a broker to the member of National Assembly in that area. He would be the person that the member of National Assembly would go to for votes in certain villages. So he's also a broker, and by broker I mean that he's someone who gets things done at the village level, and which means that he is some in PKI's case specifically, brokers or sort of the PKI leadership was really adept at managing conflicts between WAPDA, which is the power supply, water and power supply authority in Punjab, the police and the irrigation department, which obviously are not very kind to small farmers, to put it lightly. And so the leadership provided these conduits or these ways of conflict resolution, and as Dr. Noaman said, in the Taliban's case, set up an alternative administrative sort of system to resolve conflict. The leadership also has these dairas, which sort of provide them the social capital to organize people, to organize meetings, to organize the village around issues, and dairas are actually the nerve centers on which the PKI stands. And basically, as I mentioned, the small farmers are workers, are the people who go to the sit-ins, are the people who sort of do all of the work, do the mobilization, are the ones getting bait in charge, getting tear gassed, and the leaders are obviously are not at the forefront of all of that violence. Only recently we saw that a worker from the PKI was actually killed by Punjab police in the recent mobilizations in 2020, and he was not a leader; he was a small farmer, as I'm talking about. Okay, let's talk about the repertoire of the PKI and how it sort of expresses itself politically. So the PKI is not actually a monolith and is not actually very strongly it's not very strongly authoritarian. Units have a mind of their own. Authority is really diffuse, and what could happen is that local sort of districts could have their own campaigns, could have their own protests, and the center would not know about them. Or even, for example, districts of Sheikhupura, Gujranwala, and Lahore could sort of rally together and do something, whereas Bihari, Multan, and Lodha would not know about it. So the PKI is in many cases very diverse, very diffuse, and not very strongly sort of organized. And mostly what happens is that if you sort of map a life cycle of a protest, what happens is that the protest would start at a district level, maybe at a local ground or a press club, and then when the administration doesn't care, or then the administration doesn't sort of like come invite them to the negotiation table, what the PKI activists would end up doing is that they would actually sort of like rally together and call on the leaders to announce a sit-in in Lahore or Islamabad, which are the provincial or federal capitals. And these actions include refusal to pay electricity bills, demonstrations, roadblocks, sit-ins, long marches, burning electricity bills, dumping unsold produce on roads, and all of that. So they're very sort of like concerned about making optics out of their politics. Okay, so now let's talk about the disintegration and how sort of the movement is falling apart as we speak, and basically the main cause of this disintegration is that the working cadres of the PKI have seen that every time their leaders go into negotiations with the government, some kind of personal bargain is made between leaders and between government officials, and some kind of patronage bargain happens, and the whole sort of movement has to bear the cost of that. So a PKI leader would typically get a personal favor, get someone out of jail for calling off a protest. And so this really actually shows how the PKI actually is a vehicle for the assertion of the interests of the leadership, which is the second-tier capitalist farmers that we're talking about. Also, there's also discontentment about the PKI leaders not actually taking up the issues of artis. Artis are middlemen who are notorious for sort of who are actually sort of money lenders as well. So they're notorious amongst the smallholders for being exploitative, for being aggressive, and all of the kind. And they're also so they were also very corrupt as well. So and the reason why the PKI leadership doesn't take up the cause of RTs or like doesn't have a campaign against the RTs is because most of the time the leadership of or the local elite are in cahoots with the RTs who sort of allow them or have or sort of make it possible for the second tier leadership to sort of like sell their produce or market their produce most effectively. There's also nothing on land redistribution or fairer wages, as we've seen in BKU or just Shatkari Sangatna. And this is something that has been a main sort of like a criticism of agrarian populist movements in India and in Pakistan. So there's no discussion of fairer wages, and fairer wages matter because of the fact that small landholders are not just only farmers, they're also laborers. They also sort of sell their labor to larger landowners. Thus, ultimately, in conclusion, ultimately the anti-imperialist and populist framing of the PKI ends up facilitating the particular interests of the second tier of the rural capitalist class and sort of undermines the interests of the small landowners. I'm going a little over time, but I think that's about it from my end.
Okay, thank you so much, Yahya. I think. Yeah, in the service of time, we're supposed to discuss the third case, which is the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab. I'll try to give a very brief overview of this because this is the movement that leans to the left. We've left the left for last, and it encompasses a tenant movement. So what we might imagine is a classic peasant movement, a classic tenant movement, except what makes it different is that the land that it is demanding is state land, and it is operated by the military. And that the movement started in 2000, 2001, and really went very sharp in 2002 when there was a military regime in Pakistan. This kind of conjuncture of things, both the fact that it was anti-military and the fact that it was based on tenants demanding land, attracted leftists to the AMP. However, it's important to understand that, and this is in a district, Okara especially, is where this happens and where this pops off. But we can locate this actually, Yahya has described the agrarian change, and especially the fact that there's been a secular decline in tenancy in Punjab, and that's gone very low. But the fact that the military regime or a state department is doing this points to a neoliberal rationality, I think, where they want to rationalize tenure. And what they wanted to do was to end the tenancies of these tenants and turn them into fixed contracts, fixed contract holders. However, to do that, to make this transition from tenancy to fixed contract holding, they wanted the tenants to give up their rights, any claims that they may make to occupancy, which is not quite ownership, but it is a right to not be arbitrarily evicted from the land, or really not to be evicted at all. That existed in British law and then was carried into Pakistani law. And even though occupancy was ultimately abolished, it nevertheless does influence the way that courts function in Pakistan. So the military management wanted these tenants to give up their claims on the land, and the tenants said, we are really not going to do that and don't want to do that. And that sparked a very massive movement in 2002. The army came in and tried through military force to coerce tenants to sign these leases, which they refused to do. But the tenants also then refused to hand over the produce and the shares that they were supposed to give to the military management. And as a consequence, what ended up happening is that many tenants were actually able to become more prosperous, although many people died in the struggle and many people were hurt. But many tenants did manage to become more prosperous. So the kind of classic class differentiation that we see in the peasantry or in the tenantry already existed before the movement, but was perhaps exacerbated as a consequence of this movement. And so what's interesting really about the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab is that leftist element, which kind of comes from outside, but there is a leftist element that comes from within. And that's because one of the founders or one of the initiators of this movement, his name is, I think, Yunus Iqbal, was actually involved with the Bonded Labor Liberation Front in the 1990s. That's the cameo from the rural proletariat. The Bonded Labor Liberation Front was, importantly, it had activists of the Mazdoor Kisan Party working in it, which is an organization that I've written about elsewhere in the Journal of Agrarian Change, and I'm supposedly writing a book about right now. So the Mazdoor Kisan Party brought a certain sensibility to the work in the Bodied Liberation Front, but also this was the moment of the alliance. The 1990s was the moment of the alliance between the left parties and NGOs. So really a lot of the Bodied Labor Liberation Front was taken into what in Pakistan we call NGOtic directions, which you can imagine what that entails. I won't go into details. But these dynamics then also became part of the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, where a new kind of activist, a leftist activist, both endogenous to Okara, but also coming from urban areas and supporting them, allied with NGOs, facilitating through NGOs, was coexisting with the kind of conventional leadership that Yahya was describing in terms of brokerage and patronage. Ultimately, what's happened as a consequence of what we might say is a stalemate or kind of victory of the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, really it's a victory by attrition, it's not really a decisive victory, is that leftist and activist element has been overshadowed by the rich peasant, the rich tenant, the rich farmer, who resembles very much, literally, as in if you go, and I did in 2011, visited Okara, the leader of the movement, who is now the leader of the movement, very much resembles the kind of capitalist farmer that Yahya is talking about. May not be as rich, but certainly is embedded in networks of patronage, brokerage, and all of those things. So that's just a kind of overview of the movement and also embedded in electoral politics now and where it's headed. By way of conclusion, as I said, we're still kind of working on this, but I'd like to try to draw out some things that perhaps we can think about or talk about. The first is that we've argued that the emergence of these three distinct movements has to be located within broader trends of agrarian and rural economic change in Pakistan, but with a focus toward regional variation in relations of production and social and political organization. We've identified how state-led development encouraged the formation of agrarian capitalists. And while this was fairly successful in Punjab, it came at the expense of tenants who were compelled to seek wage labor, or what we can euphemistically call self-employment. In FATA, the question of agrarian capitalism is a little bit less clear, but certainly it exists. But it is fundamentally connected to a dynamic trade-based economy, which provides perhaps a dominant avenue for accumulation. So although there is agrarian accumulation in Punjab, and a lot of it is intertwined with off-farm and non-agrarian accumulation, it takes a very different form in FATA. This shift toward neoliberal development has had mixed effects and has not entirely changed the trajectory of state-led developmental policies, but in many cases has exacerbated them and led to the creation of new contradictions. In the context of FATA, we may not think of neoliberal policy, as I showed you that graph where public investment was actually increasing, but I think we need to understand neoliberalism, as David Harvey says, as a political project to restore the supremacy of capitalists, the political supremacy of capitalists. And so both the first and second war in Afghanistan need to be understood in that context. It's about making that region open and safe for capitalist economic corridors. In Punjab, we've seen it led to the reduction of state support for agrarian capitalism and petty commodity production, and has led to further increase the eviction of tenants. What's interesting is the question of whether or not these movements could, as different and diverse as they are, could be guided by left forces or progressive forces, or whether they could provide openings for the deepening of left movements. The picture that I hope we've given to you is a fairly pessimistic one. You've got the Taliban on the right, you've got the Pakistan Kisan Ittehad, led by a second tier, a national democratic, so to speak, a national bourgeoisie, or which is arraigned against the big bourgeoisie. And even when it comes to the left-led movement, the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, ultimately that takes the form of a conventional brokerage politics. So what does that mean, or where does that point to us? I think we need to kind of reach outside of Pakistan, or maybe to the past of Pakistan. Jun Boris, in his article on agrarian populism, points to movements like the Kirusang Makubu in Pilipinas, which is the KMP, the peasant movement of the Philippines, or the MST in Brazil. And he points to those as examples of left-wing populist movements, as opposed to the kind of right-wing or the centrist populism that Yahya has described in the PKI. The issue with both the MST and the KMP, if we're being honest about it, is that they're undergirded by cadre-based organizations. They are cadre-based organizations in one way, and they're undergirded by a different form of cadre-based organization, which takes different forms in both cases. In the case of the KMP in the Philippines, it is linked to the Communist Party of the Philippines. Of course, they're independent. I want to make that clear. No room for red tagging or red baiting here. However, there is a tradition of deep training of cadre, of deep movement, of deep organizing that they come out of, which in a way the Taliban approximates the closest. They don't do a very good job of it, to be clear, but they do have a way to train cater very rapidly. It also helps them that their ideology is fairly easy. They don't have a very sophisticated form of Islam. It's actually not sophisticated at all. And it draws a lot on Pakhtun Wali, which is Pakhtun norms of behavior. So that's the form of Islam. So it is more recognizable. And there is a shorthand in Pakistan. For example, if you ask many poor people why the rich are are jerks, they'll say Khuda ka khauf nahi, that they don't fear God. And so in a way, Islam or Shariat comes to represent a fear of God, which then enables justice. So there is a shorthand there. It doesn't mean I want to pray 5 times a day or I want to stop watching Bollywood movies, although that is what the Taliban want and to their own detriment. But they do have a way to rapidly train people in ideology, in organization, and of course in militancy, which I think left organizations in Pakistan are trying to come to terms with how they can do that. And so we can perhaps imagine an alternative where left groups are able to intervene in different forms of agrarian mobilization, the way that Theda Skocpol made this argument a long time ago, but maybe not necessarily with a view to immediate victories, but certainly with a view towards developing cater out of different classes and different kinds of rural populations. And the final word here that I want to say is that one thing that we haven't looked at is the dynamic where I did say that about 40% of the economically active population is in agriculture, but that is a steep decline from 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago when it was about 45%. So there is a decline in agriculture, agricultural livelihoods. And a lot of what we're seeing in rural areas is the immense dependence on a rural proletariat who've got no attention from our presentation. Jan Bremen made this critique of us earlier. But they do need attention from the left, which has also been lacking. And I know that's a very inchoate conclusion, but I hope that it sets up some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much to you, Noaman, and to you, Yahya. This was really a very interesting presentation, covered a lot of ground, and one had to stay on one's toes to follow the argument in details as it unfolded, but hugely interesting. And as you're saying, it is throwing up a number of issues, both specifically in relation to Pakistan, but also globally to thinking about struggle and mobilization. And hopefully that will be part of what we will be discussing now over the next 45 minutes. Let me start with a sort of an introductory question, maybe, just to start it all off. Now, I thought the way you analyzed both the classes, the exploitation, and the imperialist agents, how they interacted were extraordinarily interesting. I wonder then how much of this, if we're looking at the movements here and the social groups that are involved, there's always two aspects talking about movements. There's both who are involved and there's what is the politics. And it doesn't have to be the same. But the class character of the politics and the class character of who are involved do not have to be the same. Now, in this context, how agrarian is the leadership actually? They are the second tier, you're saying, in two of the areas, but you're also saying they are involved in politics, they are having factories, they are involved in accumulation outside of agriculture. So if you were to characterize the leadership and the emerging bourgeoisie, that is the leadership of two of the movements, how would you characterize them? Are they still agrarian classes, or are they less agrarian than where you started up, where they started up? So to what extent is the class difference also a difference between people that are still agrarian and people that are capitalists in development? away from agriculture. So that is one question. Another one is about Taliban. I was not sure. I characterized them. I fully understood the class character of the people that were the fighters. How would you characterize them, and how would you characterize the kind of accumulation that now takes place in Waziristan, etc.? Is that agrarian, and what is the role of the Taliban fighters in that? I didn't grasp as clearly the class relationship as it has developed there as I did in the two other areas. So that is, without going into the actual movements, just trying to clarify what are we talking about by way of class relations here. Thanks. I don't know if you want to reply straight away or if you want to collect a few, but feel free to reply straight away if you'd like to do that.
Well, Jens, I feel like your question embodies so many questions. So maybe we can start with this, and then we can move the collection. Yahya, do you want to start by talking about the leadership of the PKI?
Yeah, definitely. So as you asked about the agrarian nature of how, or whether to what extent they're still agrarian, by that I gather that you mean that to what extent do they still practice agriculture or still hold land or still sort of are involved in agricultural production. So the leaders that I interviewed, or the leaders that the PKI that I've interviewed or analyzed, most of them have diversified in
talking about the leadership of the PKI?
Yeah, definitely. So as you asked about the agrarian nature of how, or whether to what extent they're still agrarian. Is this a problem from my end? I don't.
No, not your end. It was a. Go ahead. You're good.
So yeah, so they have diversified streams of income, which means that they would own land from which they would be sort of producing for markets and producing for themselves as well, but mostly for markets. And on the other hand, they would have some kind of other gig going on. Some of the people I interviewed for this primary for my primary research had travel agencies, which means that they would facilitate sort of people out migrating from Pakistan. They would get them visas, tickets. You know the so as I mentioned, basically workers of their community to the outside. I mean. The community that they served in, and some were involved in sort of marketing for agricultural products, and so you get the point that they had diversified forms of income, but they were at the end of the day farmers as well.
In terms of the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, the one leader who our colleague Shahzad Raza has actually written a whole article on this. I forget what it's called, but it has mafia in the title, so it's good to look at it. And he describes, and this was also my experience when I went to Okara back in 2011. I met with this leader who was a peasant leader, or characterized himself as a peasant leader. But we went to his house, and it was an enormous house, which was being constructed out of concrete. It really was a palace. He had one-armed bodyguard, but he also had a retinue, which we did not take around with us, and he had all these guns. So although he was a rich peasant, although he was rooted in land, there were rumors that he'd been able to accumulate more land. But importantly, at the end of the day that I spent with him, I realized that he was also embroiled in the conflict over what we call a lari adda, or a bus station, or a truck station, or a truck stop, a bus stop, and that he was leveraging the power he had gained as a leader of the movement to connect with the state, and as a consequence, use that as a way of accumulating through that bus stop. So there is diversification for sure, and it's happening at all levels. None of the literally none of the agrarian classes we've talked about are purely agrarian. All of them are involved in off-farm employment. They're all, strictly speaking, semi-peasants or semi-farmers. You'll have people engaged in wage labor or looking for professional appointments. Depending on your agrarian class situation, it also determines what kind of work you have access to. And so we can think about this in terms of the Taliban. The actual class dynamics are really complex, and I need to do more research to actually get a better grasp on them. But the first thing we need to understand is that Waziristan itself is divided between two tribes. There's the Masouds and the Ahmedzai Wazirs. The Wazirs are a specific form of a specific lineage of the Wazirs, the Ahmedzai Wazir. And the way that the land in Waziristan was allocated was that the Masouds have more of the rocky kind of land, whereas Wazirs have more access to the relative plains. And so when there was agrarian, green revolution, irrigation, all of that investment in the 70s and 80s, that benefited the Wazirs because the kind of land they had access to was more amenable to agrarian development than the land that the Masouds had. The Masouds then went to engage rather with the state as a form of accumulation. So moving towards education, moving towards looking to get government postings. But when we're talking about that is a very limited segment of the Masouds. To be entirely honest, I'm not sure what the left behind Masouds are doing. I imagine that has a lot to do with pastoralism, and of course, there's trade. As for the Wazirs, they have access to relatively better land, but that land is also not exactly distributed in the most egalitarian of ways. There is considerable inequality, not the kind of inequality that you would find in Punjab or even in settled areas of the Northwest, but certainly inequality. And there is in Waziristan, especially over the last, maybe over the last 20, 30 years, there's, for example, nuts production, fruit production, and these are very lucrative. And they're exported into Pakistan, but they can also go the other way to Afghanistan or maybe Iran. But they then go to, I'm saying export to Pakistan, but really they're serving markets that are not necessarily domestic markets, dried fruits, stuff like that. So who's working for them? There are sharecroppers, there are smaller farmers who don't have that kind of access to capital to be able to engage in horticulture and that kind of lucrative crops. And so there's a lot of subsistence. The majority are embroiled in subsistence agriculture of one form or the other, but you'll send one brother out to try and find work in Karachi. You'll send one brother out to find work in the transport sector. You'll find one brother out to fight for the Taliban. It's that kind of stuff, or not even the Taliban, but you even go to Karachi and there you engage in militancy. Like you might form the armed wing of a different political party, like the Awami National Party had an armed wing in Karachi, for example. So these kinds of dynamics mean that, and there is a pressure, a communal kind of pressure, a tribal pressure, so to speak, to be very reductive about it, that if you leave your land, then you lose status. Therefore, somebody always has to be cultivating that land. So there's always one foot in the agrarian economy, however tenuous and however non-fulfilling it is. So what we're really talking about is, and the term semi-proletarian is it's a very ham-handed or heavy-handed way to refer to this. What it really means is that because most of this is based on secondary research, you need to go there and do primary research and figure out what class dynamics look like. But ultimately what we are talking about is everybody has some kind of foot in agriculture, and where that may not mean farming directly, it might mean pastoralism or something like that. However, they all have many feet outside of agriculture because that is simply insufficient for reproduction. However, all of this is conditioned, and the dynamic really of accumulation there is driven by smuggling and extra legal trade. And some of that money can then go back into agriculture or it gets reinvested outside, as I was saying. And that's where you have a strange capitalist class forming alongside a massive underemployed, unemployed, surplus population with one foot in agriculture. I hope that that's somewhat satisfying.
Oh, it is, and it's again hugely interesting, and it sort of points to an understanding of classes and of movements that ought to go beyond agriculture as well, which is just to extend the agenda to so that if one were to answer the questions that you put, maybe one ought to cast the net even wider. But that is more comments than anything, but hugely interesting. Helena, was that a hand earlier?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat though. I don't know if we should do that first. We cannot hear you, Jens.
We will return to the questions in the chat as well.
Okay. So let me just offer my question, which is really a comment that I'm struggling to turn into a question. Truly fascinating presentation for those of us that struggle to make out our Baluchistans from our scenes. It's perhaps just too much and too level of detail that is probably beyond our ability to understand. But one sees your attempt at summarizing and trying to come up with a comparative model to account for these very different politics. Obviously, you're talking about a country that is not merely massive, but as my own country, Colombia, very regionally distinct and with several insurgent groups that have very different politics and very different relations to agrarian social formations. And that obviously opens up all these quite interesting questions. And when you thought about comparing with Philippines or the MST, I thought that a more obvious comparison would be something like Colombia and its various guerrilla movements. But I'm very interested in something that you mentioned in the case of Fatah, which I think I've seen in so many geographies that I think you're touching into something that speaks to themes beyond Pakistan, which is the utilization of refugees or forced migrants as cheap labor. This is very central also to the emergence of some agrarian based conflicts in, for instance, the Upper Guinea Valley, in Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, classical literature. They're also looking at that. In my own field study, in my own field study in Mozambique, this mobilization and this surplus extraction from refugees is quite central. And I just was very curious to hear more about it and to understand how they are mobilized, what is produced, and how surplus is extracted from them. But not just sort of like in a descriptive manner, but surely this is to an extent leading to processes of accumulation and the disaccumulation or prioritization of these migrants, and then also processes of social differentiation. And I know I'm asking about a very specific theme, and you covered so many themes and regions in Pakistan that it might seem a bit precious, but in a way it's a question also to ask you for a more explicit connection of these processes of class formation, both in terms of classes in themselves through these processes of production, surplus extraction, accumulation, disaccumulation, social differentiation, and then what we see at the other end, which is this arguably classes for themselves with a political agenda. That sort of like that connection, I would want it to be more explicit. That is my comment question. Thank you.
Any answer to that comment question?
The questions you have are exactly the questions that I have. That kind of throwaway comment I made was based on the work of a young scholar named Hassan Turi. And he works in an agency which is called the Quram Agency, which is actually quite far from Waziristan. And he did his work at the ISS, his master's at the ISS. And if you're looking for somebody to supervise for a PhD, please, I'll connect you with him. And he's great, so I'll connect you with him. But what he's talking about is a really complex dynamic in Quram, where the tribes that own land are Shia, they belong to the Shia sect, and the tribes that do not own land belong to the Sunni sect. So when the Taliban got there, they were able to mobilize the Sunnis against the Shias, which is both a sectarian conflict and a conflict over land. But in this, then you have Afghan refugees who've been there since the 1980s and 90s. So what I'm saying is just coming from his work in terms of how to make an explicit connection with others. It's something definitely to look into here, what I can say quickly, as quickly as I can, and I tried to say this in the presentation, is that it's enabled what we might call a petty bourgeoisification, or a very small capitalist dynamic to emerge, where Afghan refugees have to undersell even those landless who are locals, because they just have literally no other way to make a living. And because they undersell them, they work very hard for very cheap. That enables these families to free up their own labor. The young men can go to Saudi Arabia or to Dubai, and often that presupposes certain forms of social and other capital that even allows you to afford a visa. You can remove women from the fields, which then increases your status. So there's that kind of petty accumulation and petty bourgeoisification that's occurring here. I do not know how that ties into larger scales of accumulation. I can only imagine. But it also entails xenophobia against Afghan. They're both Pakhtuns, but I've encountered a lot of anti-Afghan xenophobia in Pakistan, but perhaps none more than in Pakhtun areas, and that's the irony that I've noticed. So again, this is very descriptive and completely dissatisfying as far as the theoretical connections you were asking me to pull on. But I take your point, and I hope that we can explore that aspect as well.
Thanks. And so we have a few questions in the chat, but before we turn to that, let me just once more reiterate that everyone can ask questions also orally. And here we have two questions. We have Inan, but before that, Bridget came up in the chat saying, I have a question about gender, but I'd like to say it rather than write it, so you can see it's not very clear even to me. So Bridget, we would like to hear your question first, and then Iman afterwards.
Okay. My question is about the role of women in first maintaining or even in some cases being able to acquire land rights for household groups. Because one of the things that's the most striking in this account is across all the regions that there's not very much that comes up about women in the acquisition of land and class identity. And this is interesting for me because I recently read a paper, in a different context, in which someone spoke about the fact that one thing that you've raised, which is divisions of labor within families where one brother migrates and another brother is regarded as the person who's maintaining the land rights at home. Yeah, in other words, it presumes a male manager. But in some of these cases, which if I take a Southern Africa thing as a contrast, there are these migration models where both brothers migrate. The father figure may be the person who is having claims on stuff, but the tension is between men and women very often, both between husbands and wives, but between daughters-in-law and fathers, or mother-in-laws and women as well, wives. So there's something about the fixity of the picture across all of these different contexts that you're describing that implies that gender relations are fixed in Pakistan. And I wonder about that. Yeah, I mean, you all have to notice where, how unusual it is that none of those tensions came up in your account. And the other off sort of, side of that is in thinking about the class basis of the army, which clearly is a problem for you. Where does gender figure in that? And, is that ever a sort of exit for the emergence of NGOization or, alternative formation of a pequena bourgeoisie in our terms, a petty bourgeoisie, which is gendered, as well as having different regional positions or whatever. So I think the problem I'm having is sorting out the richness of your material, but which does assume that there's a kind of commonality, because after all, confronting the Pakistani state and the Pakistani army is something they all share in some ways. But on the other hand, there have to be, I started thinking, well, how is this different? How is Punjab here different from Punjab in India? I'd like to know. What goes on, what enters there? And I decided that one of the things that I would, if I were you, I'd try to sort out is thinking somewhat about this gender question in terms of the constitution of political struggles, which is the focus that both of you have. But with great complexity in the material, and one where I felt really ignorant and sort of stupid that I hadn't started by writing down on paper what the current names of everything was and plugging in where I knew something about the region, the area, the history, and where I really knew practically nothing. So it's sort of, as I said, a combination of a question and a comment. I guess I'd say, well, could you give me a reaction? Maybe that's it.
Well, yes, these are big issues. Noaman and Yahya, over to you, and then we will take Iman and Hussein, and then we will get on to the chat afterwards.
Yahya, do you want to? I think Fiza Batul has also asked a question about the role of gender and caste, and I do want to say yes, we completely obliterated caste, religion, and gender from our account. Just it's there, it exists. However, we didn't consider it in this presentation. For better or for worse. So yeah, why don't you start?
Yeah, so in the case of the Punjab and the PKI especially, as we sort of know, and as I sort of witnessed firsthand, a lot of migrant workers in the farms in Punjab are actually women. Mostly the estimates are around 45% or 50% in some areas, and most of them are women and children, and the men are off working in some place else. They're semi-proletariats themselves, and these women are especially sort of useful in cotton picking and labor-intensive work. So and when I talk to the PKI leaders about them, obviously they, as I mentioned before, they tend to ignore the plight of these workers at the very bottom of the pyramid, and they tend to sort of use this populist trope of the Kisan or the farmer, which sort of like incorporates everyone, and which also sort of gleans over these contradictions, which of gender, race, ethnicity, and like sort of different. So there's definitely an element of gender, and obviously with this neoliberal development happening, the role of migrant workers, the remuneration that's given to them, and because obviously the farmer has to manage the farm as an economically viable option. So obviously there's going to be a shrink in the share that the wage laborer gets at the end of the day for picking cotton or doing anything else on the farm, and the laborer, as I mentioned, in half of the cases are women. So definitely there needs to be more inquiry into that, and also like the point about the military and how that sort of like complicates things. I probably not sort of like grasp the whole question to the full extent, but what I think the case in Punjab, especially with dealing with the military, is that like the military sort of like portrays the mother or the sister or women in general as this figure that sacrifices the sons, the fathers, and the husbands for the homeland, and they sort of like put on this pedestal, and sort of like obviously by putting them on that pedestal, they also sort of ensure that they're not active, or they don't put or they don't have or they don't sort of like pose a threat, but it's definitely there. As I've mentioned before, there needs to be an inquiry into how all of these sort of different threads intersect into the agrarian economy and agrarian politics of Punjab.
And if I can maybe pick up from, by the way, earlier I said if you're looking for a student to supervise, this guy is also a candidate, and as you can tell, quite well developed and intelligent, so please do. But in terms of the comment that Bridget raised, and also Fiza's question, maybe if we could start with aggregate trends. And I should know this, but I don't know this. I don't know what the female labor force participation in Pakistan is and what that trend has looked like. But anecdotally, if you're sitting in urban areas, we can see increase of women in wage labor of different kinds. So the blue collar wage labor in factories around Lahore, but also a kind of a sky blue labor, if you want to, because it's not quite white collar, it's not quite blue collar. It's for example, serving as a receptionist, but in a hotel or in retail and services. There is an increasing presence of women in these industries. And anecdotally, at least, there is an understanding that as purchasing power has declined over the last several years, many families are having to send women into the workforce. So what that looks like in urban areas and what effect that has on drawing labor out of agrarian areas is a big question. The point that Yahya made is a very important one, that especially rural labor, a huge chunk of that is women. But when it comes to smallholders and landowners, that's where the question of status comes in. And Bridget, you're correct that does have a kind of fixity across Pakistan, but especially in northern Pakistan, especially in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or the northwest, and actually extends throughout northern South Asia, right into Rajasthan and up to UP. I'm not sure about the Indian Punjab. Maybe Shreya can help us understand that a little bit better. But certainly UP and Rajasthan, the dynamics that we understand there are quite similar in the sense that women working is not seen as a good thing. Certainly women working in the fields is not seen as a good thing. And you want, Harun's written about this, Harun Akram Lodi has written about this in terms of the dynamics in the Northwest frontier. Based on the last time I was in the Northwest frontier, which was last year, what he's written is more or less still accurate. And his data was from the 1990s, which is as your class status increases, as your accumulation increases, as your income increases, you will spend more of that to withdrawing female labor from the fields. And that also entails a strict control of land, which does not go to women. And what these movements, all of them, have meant for women's ownership of land is just about nothing. There was an opening with the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, with the tenant movement, because women played an important role in confronting the military and the army when men were underground. However, as soon as that pressure eased up, the men then reasserted themselves. There's actually a wonderful documentary that you can watch on YouTube or on Daily Motion. It's called 2 Steps Forward, which is about the role of women in the Ukara peasant movement. And they describe how the men reasserted themselves and told the women, it's now time for you to go back to your homes. And while that didn't necessarily mean that women did go back to their homes, in many cases it did, but that did mean that men reasserted their control over land. And that again speaks, I think, to the biggest failure of the left in Pakistan. The stuff that I study in Hashtnagar in the Northwest, the Anjuman Mazareen-e Punjab, has been on the gender question. That is the biggest failure of the left in Pakistan. But how to change that is difficult. I mean, personally, I felt far more threatened when I've spoken about gender relations in Pakistan. I feel like any man might kill me immediately, compared to if I talk about class or injustice or the state or even the army. You can talk about that to an extent. But if you start talking about trying to change gender relations in Pakistan, you will face immediate hostility across the board. In rural areas and urban areas, it's actually frightening. Unless you're hanging out with upper class petty bourgeois intellectuals, which is a very different thing. So that's not really an answer, but it is more description. I'm sorry. And in terms of the petty bourgeoisie, that question, NGOization has served as a vehicle for the employment of women in rural areas and also in urban areas. Oftentimes, it's actually urban women going to work in rural areas, but in some cases, it's also women from rural towns and villages getting employed by those NGOs, but under very constrained circumstances and having to look at the kind of gender dynamics that exist in segregation that does exist across Pakistan. So NGOs have operated as a mechanism for educated youth to get employment, and that does include women. About the army, I'm really not sure. I don't think that the army has they do have a public relations department. It's called the ISPR, which does feature, for example, women pilots and women captains and commanders. And increasingly, I see that woke Twitter is following women in the police force, who are just as discriminatory towards working class men as men in the police force are. But those kinds of dynamics, as Helena said in the comments, we definitely need to understand this more, and it's something that we need to pick on and more, and hopefully we will.
Okay, thanks. Now we're now in one sense fortunate position that we have many questions waiting. Unfortunately, we've only got 10 minutes left, so I think we have to club them a bit together now. Let us take the ones that are in the chats first. Shall we? I'm asking Enrique to take the ones in the chat you can see here, and also Shreya to hear if there are any questions in the chat on YouTube. So Enrique and Shreya, could you step in with the questions, please?
Sure, Jens. Yeah, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and then I have one of my own, very, very short. So the first one is from Fisa. She asked, how do you see this Arab operation? It's a military operation in 2014, and how that operation sort of shapes the agrarian landscape in Waziristan, if I pronounce that correctly. So that's one thing, this military operation. And the other one was partially sort of answered, but perhaps you can expand a little bit more. Bhupendra is interested in knowing about class differences, gender and caste in shaping politics, the PKI politics in Punjab. So if you can expand on the class, gender and caste dimensions of that. And my question, it's about the boundaries of these movements that you spoke about. In my own research in my country, in Bolivia, it is not uncommon to see one person belonging to different organizations. So some people from the highlands, for example, they will belong to a particular peasant trade union. When they move to the lowlands, they can belong to an indigenous organization. It's the same person, it's just belonging to different. I was wondering to what extent the boundaries of those organizations are rigid, or these kind of things also happen. Thanks.
Thanks, and Shreya has told me in a private message that there is no questions on YouTube. In that case, I think we will just ask Iman to also come up with his question now, and then we'll take the two last questions afterwards. Iman,
yeah, thank you so much, and I will be very quick with my questions because they're clarifying questions. So the first question basically is that you mentioned there's a decline in agricultural labor participation and also a decline in agricultural productivity. So why is that? And B, what are the consequences of that? Where are people really going? And B, is that actively producing a food insufficiency in terms of commodities being available? And the second question basically is that you mentioned how the Taliban took over the power of the Mushran and the Maliks, right? So, and you say that it was a violent process, and it was also a process based on how they had organizational capacity and mobilization capacity. So what does that really mean? What does that organization and mobilization capacity mean beyond Islam and violence? And the third question is a little complicated, but I'm sorry if I'm oversimplifying things. But in the three changes that you mentioned, I see this pattern where there is a class correlation in terms of the groups that lead the movement. And what we really see is that the group that has more class power, their interests get forwarded, whereas the most oppressed within that correlation really don't go forward, right? So why is that? And how do you really build movements that are based on the most oppressed? Yeah, those three questions. Thank you so much.
I was going to ask you to give us some quick answers. I'm not sure that's possible, but please, could we have some reactions from the speakers on these questions?
Okay, I guess I'll try to take these. I think Bhupendra's question we'll have to kind of postpone that, because I think we've discussed gender to some degree, but we haven't really gone to the caste question. Perhaps we can at some point. Fiza's question is a really good one and an important one. It seems that after the military conducted operations in Fatah in 2014, there are reports, but I don't know how, we have to verify these reports. We don't really know, but the military occupation there is not simply one of clearing out the Taliban, but it also, one thing in Jens's question about the political economy of the areas, I left out the discussion of timber and mining. That's also very important throughout Fatah. And how those are controlled, how those are allocated, allegedly, there are now, the Pakistan Army military has a lot of corporations that it's connected to. And so some people say that a lot of that is now being operated through the army. In any case, the frank truth is that in these border areas, all kinds of government posts, all kinds of government postings, whether they're military or non-military, are very lucrative positions. To the extent that there are allegations that people pay to be appointed as bureaucrats to these areas. Why? Because the extra legal trade is so lucrative and you get to regulate that. Now, this is what people say. I'm saying these are allegations. I by no means mean to impugn any of the institutions in Pakistan, which I understand to be, exemplary. So these are some of the questions that have been raised and that require further investigation. So I'll just leave that one at that. The question that Enrique asked based on Colombia, by the way, I was there 2 years ago, and I was really thinking about how we could think about comparison between Colombia and Pakistan. Although Colombia, of course, is much smaller and has very different dynamics, but also in terms of having a conflict that has rent the society apart, it's very interesting. And agrarian conflicts or rural conflicts that have had those impacts. It is the same in Pakistan. You can have multiple political affiliations. You can be a member of the Mazdoor Kisan Party, which is supposedly a leftist socialist organization, but you're going to go vote for the Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz, which is the representative of the urban industrial bourgeoisie or a certain urban industrial bourgeoisie in Pakistan. And that happens all the time. And a lot of people don't necessarily see the contradiction. I've got some anecdotes about inadvertently meeting somebody who allegedly was fighting in Waziristan against the Americans. But he stayed up all night watching Bollywood films, right? So that's not a political question, but it is a question about culture, and it is a question about ideology and how these things are not necessarily black and white the way that we think. So definitely the political affiliations in Pakistan are very often multi-layered, and people who are part of social movements will vote for parties or will be workers for parties that might appear to have very different ends. Iman's multiple questions are very good. I think you answered your first question. You said there's a decline in agricultural productivity and a decline in participation of labor force in agriculture. Why is that? I think those two things are probably linked, right? The decline in agricultural productivity has something to do with the fact that it's less able to sustain agrarian livelihoods. And a lot of that has to do with the retrenchment of the state out of agriculture and the lack of support under a neoliberal thing. And really the lack of any vision on the part of the Pakistani ruling classes towards how agriculture can be part of a project of national development that is not simply export oriented. The question of the Taliban and organizational capacity, this is a really good one and an important one that we could probably break down. But one of them is, how well are you able to train? How well are you able to recruit, train, and really habituate recruits to the culture of your organization? How tightly and how disciplined are your recruits and your cater to the mission of the organization? How tight is the leadership of the organization? How well coordinated are they? And what is the coordination between the apex and the base of your organization? How capable are you at fundraising? How capable are you at intervening? The Maoist principle of from the masses to the masses. How good are you at doing that? And Taliban are actually pretty good at doing that. Understanding what are the local grievances of people, intervening in those, formulating solutions for them, and then executing on those solutions with the participation to some extent of those people, or simply with the participation of guns, which is also something Maoists are very good at, right? So those kinds of dynamics are important. As for the last question that you're asking about how do you ensure that within any multi-class movement, the interests of the powerful classes don't overshadow those of the poor, the lower classes, that's a great question. No answer to that one, and that's something that is a huge topic to assess. But thank you for the question.
Let me just say that we are just a minute. Yeah, that we are close to the formal finishing line. So there will be people that will have to leave now. But I think those of us that have the energy and time might just hopefully that includes the speakers will take the last two questions and answers as well. But thanks to everyone who've been here and listened in and well, we will continue for a little while more so we can get the last drops squeezed out of the session. Yahya, would you also like to comment on the questions now?
Yeah, like to Oman, the last question that where she talked about why does it happen that people who have less class power in a movement, their interests are left behind or they're put on the back burner, and people who have more class power actually sort of like steer the direction of the movement. It's fairly intuitive if you look at it from afar, but like in my work on PKI, what I found was that because and like that this has been observed in the Indian populist movements as well, that the leadership exercises a hegemony of sorts on the working cadres, where this sort of like populist trope of defending the rights of the Kisan or the farmer are shown to be the thing or to be the cause, and where everyone and their intentions are shown to be purely towards the betterment of the farmer. So like this hegemony that they exercise over the small holders enables them to actually sort of take steps which are not sort of like favorable or which are actually a detriment to the small holders. And this obviously happens because of the vertical sort of class relations that happen, that sort of exist in these multi-class sort of organizations. Yeah, that's my response.
Thanks. So Hussein and Surendra, you now have the honor of delivering the last couple of questions. Over to you, Hussein.
Okay, thank you. So it was a fascinating discussion. I would try to be quick. So like I would like to talk about this connection between Taliban and Pashtunwali. So like it's a comment, but the speakers, I'd be pleased if they could comment on that. That in fact, like what makes Taliban a Pashtun organization, like, and then we see that Taliban have targeted many Pashtuns and the Pashtun Nationalist Party. So this connection between Taliban and Pashtunwali, and secondly, like this connection between Taliban and like this agrarian dynamics. Like Taliban, in fact, if we try to kind of understand the dynamics of the Pashtun belt, so there is this dynamic between Khan versus, in Pashto we say Kasabgar, the people who don't have this land and artisans, and then this Khan versus Mullah. So like I would try to kind of understand these, dynamics that, in fact, Taliban, they are more against the agrarian elites. So I would be pleased if they could comment on that. Thank you.
Very interesting. And Surendra, you put your questions in the chat, but would you like just to say them out loud as well?
Thank you, sir. My question is for you, gents, for you, how to describe the farmer or peasant identity in, especially in South Asian countries or in some continent, because the identity of farmers is very ambiguous identity, and many times I see that one author sometime he or she describing as a peasant, or sometime agriculture peasant farmers, or sometime farmers. And my second question is how the neoliberal policies reshaping the character of farmers movement. I mean, in how the neoliberal policies changing the character of farmers movement in the era of neoliberal world, in the neoliberal world. And third is, obviously you pointed out that the class character or caste character in especially the role of dominant caste or class in peasant or farmers movements. These are my three questions. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think I would leave it to Noaman and Yahya to answer them, and we could discuss another time ourselves as well. Noaman and Yahya.
Okay, I'll do a division of labor. Yahya, you take on the Punjab questions, and I'll try to take on the questions about the Taliban. And Hussein Saib, I think you asked very good questions and important ones. It actually made me think about these in important ways. I think maybe to start with your last question, this question of Khan versus Qasabgar and Khan versus Mullah. In some ways, I think what I was trying to show was that the Taliban were able to mobilize an alliance between the Mullah and the Qasabgar. Or if Qasabgar are considered Kasharan in the political history of Waziristan, or even not just the Waziristan, but even if we talk about dynamics of the Taliban and how they spread to Swat, there it's also maybe even more clear, because the Khan there is far more of an agrarian elite in many ways than the Khans or the Masharan in Fatah's, in different parts of Fatah, depending on what part of Fatah we're in. But certainly in Swat, the dynamic of the Taliban also reflects that. There is this kind of unity or this alliance between tenants, rural youth, semi-proletarians, the Qasabgar and the Mullah, who's historically and literally Mullah Fazlullah, right? And who himself was famously was a ski lift seat operator. So certainly, not a kind of elite in that sense. And forging the unity, or his father-in-law Sufi Muhammad was also premised on those. Although both Sufi Muhammad and Mullah Fazlullah were also able to mobilize. They were also able to mobilize Khans to their cause, or at least many property owners to their cause. So it's not clear cut that this is simply a class-based movement. It's not. It's actually far more complex than that. But in many ways, in terms of its foot soldiers or the driving force, it is based on this kind of alliance between Qasabgar and Mullah, or insofar as we understand the Mullah to be part of the Kasharan. And I think that's a dynamic that we can think about. The second is I think your question was, can we consider the Taliban to be a Pakhtun organization? And the answer, I think, has to be both yes and no. From an ideological perspective, I don't think the Taliban are particularly interested in restricting themselves to Pakhtun politics. So even in Afghanistan now, even the Afghan Taliban are now actively reaching out to non-Pakhtun bases of support and recruiting people from non-Pakhtun ethnic groups. And in Pakistan, the Tehreek-e-Taliban tried to incorporate Punjabi militant groups. But those alliances were not durable. Those did not remain for long. And the Taliban was certainly not able to penetrate in any meaningful way into non-Pakhtun areas. So the presence they had was maybe in Karachi, but beyond that, in urban Pakistan, we don't really see it in Punjab or in Sindh in any real way. So ideologically, they're not Pakhtun, but sociologically, they're definitely Pakhtun movement, and they come out of that. And of course, they attack Pakhtun nationalists, but Pakhtun nationalists also attack Pakhtun nationalists. You know, Pakhtuns have attacked Pakhtuns for a very long time, and they'll continue to do so because there's no one unitary or homogeneous Pakhtun political identity, and there never has been, and we cannot say there never will be. But it simply was never the case. For example, that Bacha Khan or Achakzai have spoken for all Pakhtuns. They never have, and I think we often act toward detriment. I'm not saying that you and I do, but I'm saying many people do when we conflate Pakhtun politics simply with nationalist politics. Pakhtun politics has taken many forms, including support for Muslim League, including support for Pakistan, including support for Mazdoor Kisan Party, for example, which fought National Awami Party. So there's all kinds of forms that Pakhtun politics takes, and Taliban in that sense are one emergence of one representation of sociologically a phenomenon that has originated amongst Pakhtuns, which then I think leads to your question about Pakhtun Wali. And to the extent that I understand the Taliban, I mean, Harun Akram Lodi has this article on the Afghan Taliban, which really, in very good detailed ways, looks at how the Taliban are a response to the fraying of certain norms or standards that we might expect from Pakhtun Wali. And especially in the Pakistani case, we can certainly point to how the position of Masharan is increasingly based not on the kind of honor that you get from practicing Pakhto in a way, but it comes from money, and it comes from cash, and it comes from corrupt relationships with political agents, and from accumulation in these ways, which even on itself would maybe be okay, except for the fact that when you go to the jirga is no longer operating in a way that is egalitarian or equitable. It's no longer, not that it was ever equal or egalitarian, but certainly there was this idea that the adjudication in the jirga that's being done by maliks or the mashran is going to be fair, is going to be reasonable. But increasingly what we see in jirgas across the board, not only in tribal areas, but also in settled areas, is that jirgas no longer earn the respect that they once used to. And that Masharan no longer have the respect that they once used to. And that there is a fraying of, or a deterioration of a moral economy that we can expect is supposed to be about how you do Pakhto, or how you are as a Pakhtun. And whether or not you're actually a man and a Pakhtun. And it is very gendered, of course, and arguably that's partly what the Taliban are responding to. So I know that. Then I hope that helps and answer some of those questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yahya.
I think Dr. Noaman covered all of the questions. If there are any remaining, I can answer them, especially on Punjab and PKI.
Well, there was the big question about the identity of the farmer in the Indian subcontinent, whether peasantry is still alive in the neoliberal world, and how neoliberal policies reshape farmers' movement. But maybe that is a question that isn't to be answered in a few minutes here. But a big question that we all need to think about, because that is, I guess, part of the big agenda of understanding agrarian change.
Yeah.
So we can leave it there, and simply what is left then is for me to thank the speakers, Yahya and Noaman, for a very interesting and in-depth presentation, that also managed to bring out the political perspectives very well. Maybe we didn't quite manage to get to where you wanted us to come to, namely an understanding of how to organize them right now, but maybe that is just too much to ask for in this session. That will come, I'm sure. And thanks to everyone that stayed with us till now, and for those that asked questions, or for those that just were part of the session. And that's all. That's it. We'll draw to a close now, and see you in 2 weeks' time to our next seminar, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for listening in.